let's say that I grant that aseity is an extrinsic property. God the Father is ase because nothing else causes him to exist. Okay, that's fine. Still, there is the question of whether or not there might be some intrinsic property of God's that can complicate things here a bit. Because it seems to me that if there are extrinsic properties at all, extrinsic properties ultimately have to be grounded by the intrinsic properties, either of that thing that has the extrinsic property or of something else's. For example, Khalil has the extrinsic property of being seen by me. But that's because not just he just happens to have that property, but it's because I happen to have the intrinsic property of seeing, something that is Khalil. So I'm undergoing a certain visual process, and in virtue of my undergoing that certain visual process, which is intrinsic to me, Khalil has an extrinsic property. So if a thing has an extrinsic property, it's because something else, either that thing or something else, has an intrinsic property. The reason why nothing else causes God the Father to exist is because God the Father has a certain intrinsic property, which we might call self-existence. Now, if this property, if God does have this property of self-existence, which is the reason why he exists and is the reason why nothing else causes him to exist and nothing else can cause him to exist, then the question is, does he have this property of self-existence essentially or not? If the property of self-existence is a part of God's essence, then the Son and the Spirit do not share in God's essence because they don't have self-existence. If the property of self-existence is not a part of God's essence, then he's composite because he has his essence and then he has this additional property of self-existence. I want to try to put you in a bind here. I'm sorry, I don't mean harm by it, but I want to catch you in a trap. I think that if you're going to say that God is ase, even if you grant that aseity is an extrinsic property, ultimately extrinsic properties are explained in virtue of intrinsic properties. So there must be some intrinsic property somewhere which explains why God is ase. It can't be in anything else because before God creates anything, there is nothing else. And God is ase before he creates anything. So it must be in God. Now, this property, I say, which makes God to be ase, will be, I'll call it self-existence. And then the question is, does God have self-existence essentially or not? If he has it essentially, then the Father and the Son do not have the same essence because the Son does not have self-existence. If he does not have it essentially, if the Father does not have self-existence essentially, then the Father is composite. He has an essence, and then he has this additional property of being self-existent.
The first thing I would say is I don't believe that the extrinsic properties are grounded upon intrinsic properties. I really think that's an incorrect assumption. Just given the definition of an intrinsic property, the very simple one that I was working with, that intrinsic property is one that you have in virtue of yourself and nothing else. So the converse of that is I have an extrinsic property if I have it in virtue of something else. So the reason why I have a property extrinsically is because of something else having a property or me standing in a relation to something else. Now, let's say we go with your example. So Khalil has the extrinsic property of being seen by Stephen, and you have the property of seeing Khalil. Well, that property that you said was intrinsic, seeing Khalil, is not an intrinsic property. That's extrinsic, because you only have the property of seeing Khalil because Khalil exists and he's there. That's the reason that you have that property. Or seeing the computer screen in front of me, I only have that because that's in front of me. So the properties that you were saying, they're both actually extrinsic. The extrinsic property that Khalil has of being seen by Stephen is had because of Stephen seeing him. But then the property that Stephen has of seeing Khalil is only had because Khalil is there to be seen. So it's not had in virtue of yourself, it's had in virtue of another.
I agree with you, depending on how the property is phrased. My property of seeing Khalil can make it sound like, at the very least, it can make it sound like it's a relational property. But it is still true that if there were nothing true about me intrinsically, Khalil could not have the property of being seen by me. Because at the very least, you can name, I am undergoing some sort of visual process. All right. So I am undergoing a visual experience of some sort. And then you can add to that property various other things which make it to be the case that I'm seeing Khalil. And then from the fact that I'm seeing Khalil, you can say that Khalil is seen by me. So still, even if it's not immediate, you can trace a line back from the extrinsic property that Khalil has to an intrinsic property that I have. So it doesn't have to be direct. It can be by various mediating factors. But what I'm going to say is that you cannot have an extrinsic property without an intrinsic property somewhere.
Okay. I have no problem with that, but I don't believe that presents a problem. Because I think with the definition, it would have to be that an extrinsic property is had if, in part, you have it because of something else. So If in that chain you have that property in virtue of something else, then that makes it extrinsic. So if we were to look at, for example, my power or my ability to lift something, that seems to be intrinsic. It's intrinsic to me. I have that ability in and of myself and not in virtue of something else. But you seeing Khalil, even though, as you were saying, there is a sort of the grounding chain might terminate in something that's intrinsic, your ability to see. In that chain, you will have a dependence upon something outside of yourself. And so that will make that property that you have extrinsic. But let's say we grant all of these sort of issues and we go with what you were saying about self-existence. I believe that self-existence is a reducible property. Because that's why, for example, in the presentation, we sort of can flow. I flowed between self-existent and being uncaused. I believe that being self-existent is just sort of reducible to being uncaused. Why is God self-existent? Because there's nothing else that causes. I take God to have a brute form of existence. So there isn't any explanation for why he exists. Other people might say that God does have an explanation. His explanation for his existence is his nature. So he's self-existent in that fashion. So again, it sort of depends upon if you believe that God has an explanation for him actually existing. Does it terminate in anything? I would say that the answer to why does God exist? Well, he's uncaused. He's ungrounded. That's why he exists. He's just ungrounded, and that's where it stops. And I won't go to a further property of self-existence. But let's say we grant that as well, and we go with that further property of self-existence. We go to the dilemma you sort of raised of does it, if it's part of the essence of the Father, then it means that the Son and the Spirit cannot have that as his essence. I would disagree with you because within essence, there are two forms of essence. There is a particular essence or individual essence, and there is a general essence or kind essence. So the kind essence is a thing that you have in virtue of being part of the kind. So for example, I am part of the kind human, and so are both of you. And so we all share in that essence of being human. We have the general essence of being human. But then we also have our own particular essence, which allows us to be individuated within that kind. And my individual essence will be Joshness, Khalilness, and you have, and then Stephenness, that whatever it is that makes you what you are as a particular entity, that will be your individual or particular essence. Now, when it comes to self-existence, someone could easily just say self-existence is part of the particular essence of the Father. So he is a self-existent one that allows us to individuate him, but it's nothing that makes him part of his general essence. But Branson, he argues that being uncaused or being self-existent is part of the individual essence of the Father. And it's not part of the general essence. So similar to what I was saying. But then the further question is, why is it part of the individual essence and not part of the general essence? You then have to go with my argument of the things that are part of the individual essence of God are his extrinsic properties. The things that are part of his general essence are his intrinsic properties that he shares with the other things within that kind. You still haven't really dealt with the problem of saying that because it's an essential property of God, that he cannot share the same essence of the Son and Spirit, because it's just simply within his particular essence and not in the general essence which he shares with the Son and the Spirit.
In the logical moment before the generation of the Son, before there is a Son, there is just the ultimate principle. He exists. He doesn't have any extrinsic properties because there's nothing else to exist, but he still has to have a personal essence. So there must be something in his personal essence, namely his self-existence. If you put the self-existence in his common essence, then the Son doesn't share the common essence anymore. There is a certain relation of priority, one to the other. And then you have to think, okay, well, if there is going to be a relation of priority, one to the other, then that which is prior has to be complete. It has to have complete existence logically before that which is posterior comes about. And then it seems that's all that you require for my argument to go through, because prior to the generation of the Son, there is no more Father anymore. He has to be something before he generates the Son, and that means that he has to have self-existence.
I have a problem with logical moments, specifically when it comes to the Trinity, because I don't believe there is any logical moment when the Son doesn't exist. I actually believe that logical moments don't seem to make sense. I know what you're saying with, for example, in a deductive argument, you have logical steps. But when it comes to the Son, there is no logical moment where the Son is not generated, because it's a necessitating act of the Father. If the Father exists, the Son is always there. So there is no logical sort of prior moment to the Son being generated. That will only work if there's a temporal moment. So I think a good way to think about this is like with Molinism, for example, where you have sort of these logical moments that God has: natural knowledge, middle knowledge, and free knowledge. But that only works because there's a sequential temporal sequence where God actually has this knowledge, he then has the middle knowledge, and then he acts, and then there's a free knowledge that he possesses. But when it comes to the Father and the Son, it's always necessarily the case that the Son is there. It's an active essence that the Son exists. And so there can never be a logical moment where the Son doesn't exist. So I think that sort of counterexample just doesn't seem to work at all. I can't just picture a time when the Son wasn't there, because then the Father wouldn't be there, because it's an essential act to the Father to bring about the Son.